The morning air at Naval Station Norfolk was thick with salt and diesel, the familiar smell of ships and machinery that marked the world's largest naval base. Sailors in uniform streamed through the gates, their boots striking pavement in rhythm. Beyond the fences, traffic rolled on Hampton Boulevard like any other day, commuters sipping coffee, car radios buzzing with the usual chatter. And then there was Elena Cruz. She stood out, not because of what she wore, but because of how she carried herself. A plain leather jacket, worn jeans, and black boots ordinary clothes. But the way she moved, the deliberate calm in every step, made her different. She had the kind of presence that turned heads without asking for attention, the sort of posture born of training, discipline, and years of carrying burdens heavier than most civilians could imagine. Still, to the untrained eye, she was just another woman standing near the gates, waiting. She leaned against a low brick wall, hands in her pockets, eyes shaded by aviator sunglasses. Every so often, she glanced toward the flow of sailors, searching for a face. It wasn't long before security took notice. 2 federal agents in dark windbreakers crossed the lot, moving fast. Their shoulders squared, radios clipped, eyes locked on her as if they had been hunting her for weeks. Elena noticed them before they reached her. She had been trained to notice things like that, the way men carried tension in their shoulders, the subtle signals of approach. She didn't run. She didn't flinch. She just straightened and waited. "Ma'am," the taller one barked, flashing a badge as he slowed to a stop. "Department of Defense." "Step away from the wall." Elena didn't move at first. Her lips pressed together in a line, her sunglasses hiding the calculation in her eyes. Slowly, she pushed off the wall and faced them. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice steady. The shorter agent smirked. "You tell us. You've been seen around this base, claiming to be something you're not." "I haven't claimed anything," Elena replied flatly. "Cut. Beact." The tall one moved closer, invading her space. "You've been telling people you're a Navy SEAL. We both know that's not true. You've got no record, no history, nothing." Around them, sailors slowed their steps, curious. A couple of young men in uniform exchanged glances, whispering as they passed. The words "stolen valor" traveled quick, sharp as a knife. Elena heard it, felt the sting of it, but didn't react. "I'm not resisting," she said calmly. "But you're making a mistake." The short agent pulled out a set of handcuffs. "The mistake is yours. Pretending to be a SEAL? That's a federal crime under the Stolen Valor Act. You're coming with us." The cuffs clicked cold around her wrists. Elena didn't fight. She let them tighten the steel, though her wrists bore faint scars that told stories none of these men would ever hear. People stared now. A sailor shook his head in disgust. "Pathetic," he muttered. Another laughed under his breath. "Some people really can't help themselves." A woman at the bus stop pulled out her phone, recording. The agents didn't stop her. They almost seemed to welcome it. Proof for the world that justice was being done. Elena kept her chin up as they walked her to the black SUV waiting nearby. Every step was measured, controlled, though inside her chest something twisted anger, frustration, but also a familiar coldness, the kind that had kept her alive in places where silence and composure meant survival. The taller agent pushed her into the back seat. "You've been playing games too long," he muttered. "People like you disgust me. Men died for that title you're stealing." Elena turned her head toward him, her sunglasses now removed, her eyes sharp and unblinking. "And some of us died without names at all," she said softly. The agent frowned, confused, but slammed the door shut before replying. The SUV rolled through the gates, leaving behind the stares and murmurs. Elena watched the base recede, memories flickering in her mind training grounds under moonlight, The burn of salt water in her lungs, the weight of gear heavier than her own body. Those memories weren't supposed to exist. On paper, they didn't. But they lived in her, in every scar, every reflex, every breath she took. As the vehicle sped toward the federal building downtown, she thought about how it had come to this. She hadn't asked to be noticed. She hadn't told anyone she was a SEAL. Someone must have seen her on base, recognized the way she moved, the way she spoke, and drawn conclusions. Or maybe it had been deliberate, someone digging into her past, trying to unravel threads that weren't supposed to be pulled. Now the trap was set. When they arrived, the agents led her through a side entrance, away from the public lobby. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in pale, unforgiving brightness. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and old carpet. It was a place built for paperwork and confessions, not for truth. In the booking room, they emptied. Her pockets, wallet, keys, a folded photo she carried of her teen faces blurred from years of wear. The short agent snorted when he saw it. "You cut this out of a magazine?" Elena said nothing. They logged her belongings, fingerprinted her, and snapped photos. At every step, the agents spoke to her like she was beneath them. A fraud caught at last. She endured it with the same stoicism she had once endured brutal training ice baths, forced marches, endless drills. Pain was temporary. Survival was permanent. When it was over, they locked her wrists again and guided her toward a steel door. "You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself," the tall agent said with mock sympathy. "But I dropped the act. Judges don't like liars." Elena paused at the threshold. For the first time since her arrest, she allowed herself a thin smile. "You think I'm lying," she said quietly. "But the truth doesn't fit in your files." The agent frowned but shoved her forward. The door slammed behind her. Elena sat alone in the holding room, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. She rested her cuffed hands on the table, staring at the reflection of her own tired face in the polished steel surface. She thought of her brothers in arms, men who had sworn secrecy just as she had. They lived hidden lives, their victories erased, their failures buried. She thought of the promises she had made to serve, to protect, to never reveal what could never be spoken. And now she sat in chains, accused of betraying the very thing she had sacrificed for. The irony was almost unbearable. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. If there was one thing she had learned, it was patience. Missions had taught her to wait, sometimes hours, sometimes days, for the right moment. This was just another mission, another hostile environment. She would wait. She would endure. And when the truth finally surfaced, when someone finally recognized what those agents could not see, she would be ready. For now, she sat in silence. Outside the holding room, agents filed their reports, convinced they had caught a fraud. Outside the building, news crews picked up whispers of an arrest. And somewhere far above them, in offices lined with flags and medals, a retired admiral would soon receive a phone call that would change everything. But Elena Cruz did not think of that. Yet, she thought only of the chains around her wrists and the ghosts of missions past. And she waited. The door shut with a heavy metallic clang, sealing Elena Cruz inside the interrogation room. The sound echoed like a cell door closing, final and unyielding. The walls were painted a shade of gray, designed to leach warmth out of anyone who stared. At them too low, a single fluorescent bulb buzzed above, its light pooling on the metal table at the center of the room. Elena sat with her hands cuffed, the steel biting faintly into her skin. She'd been through worse ropes and training that cut into her wrists until the flesh blistered, parachute harnesses that left bruises like handprints across her chest. Pain didn't bother her. What bothered her was the situation. She had No way to tell her story without betraying an oath sworn in blood and silence. Minutes passed. Then the door opened and two men entered. The same federal agents from outside, tall and short, as she had already categorized them in her head. Behind them came another figure, broader, carrying a folder so thick it looked swollen. He dropped it onto the table with a dull thud, then pulled up a chair opposite Elena. "Named Special Agent Mullen," the broad man said, his voice gravelly, "rehearsed from years of interviews. We're going to clear a few things up today." "That folder?" He tapped it with thick fingers. "It's everything we've found on you so far. And let me be blunt, there's nothing. No military record, no SEAL training, not a single deployment. But out there," he jabbed a thumb toward the hallway, "you've been walking around like you earned that trident. Care to explain?" Elena didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stretch, studying their faces. The agents wanted her to break quickly, to stumble, to plead. She recognized the tactic pressure through stillness. She had used it herself once, in places where the enemy spoke languages she barely understood, but fear translated perfectly. "Finally," she said, "what you're looking for isn't in that folder." Mullen leaned back, chuckling. "I'll bet. Because it doesn't exist. We checked. No woman has ever completed SEAL training. End of story." The short agent smirked, adding, "You might have gotten away with it if you picked Army or Marines. But SEALs? That's sacred ground. You picked the wrong lie, lady." Elena met his eyes. "You think I picked this?" Her tone was calm, not defensive. That calm unnerved him more than any outburst could. Mullen opened the folder and spread its contents across the table. Elena Cruz, born Miami, Florida. Nursing degree, 2 semesters incomplete. A couple of part-time jobs. A DUI charge at 22. Nothing special. He flipped the page, sliding it toward her. "So where's the gap? Where's the service record? You can't just disappear for years and come back with war stories. Who coached you?" Elena stared at the sheet. The information was accurate, but incomplete, like a puzzle missing its core pieces. She remembered the day her name had been erased. The briefing where she was told that from that moment forward, she didn't exist. She remembered signing the non-disclosure, the cold weight of secrecy sealing her fate. She couldn't tell them, not these men. "You're asking the wrong questions," she said at last. Mullen leaned forward, his bulk casting a shadow across the table. "No, I'm asking the exact right questions. And you're refusing to answer because you know the truth. This whole act collapses the second we put you in front of a judge." The tall agent snorted. "She thinks she's Jason Bourne or something. Classified missions, huh? Give me a break." Elena shifted slightly in her chair, the cuffs rattling. "Do I look like I'm laughing?" Mullen slammed a hand on the table, the sound cracking like a gunshot. "Enough games. You're looking at federal charges. Impersonating a SEAL isn't some harmless stunt. It disrespects every man who bled for that title. You want to walk out of here without prison time? Start talking. Tell us who you really are." The words stung, not because they accused her, but because they echoed doubts she had carried for years. She had bled, she had nearly died, and yet officially she wasn't one of them. No recognition, no validation. Just whispers and shadows. Her throat tightened, but she forced her voice steady. "I told you, you won't find me in your databases. My missions never happened. My training was sealed. That folder is empty because it's supposed to be." Mullen barked a laugh, shaking his head. "You hear yourself? That's the kind of nonsense we get from wannabes who spend too much time online." He leaned closer. "Nobody believes you." Elena studied him. His eyes were hard, but beneath the bluster, she saw something else, a flicker of doubt. Not because he believed her, but because her composure didn't fit the profile of a fraud. She wasn't begging, wasn't inventing wild details to sound authentic. She was silent, careful, unshaken. That alone gnawed at him. The tall agent whispered something to Mullen, who frowned but nodded. They slid a recorder onto the table and pressed a button. The red light blinked alive. "Let's start from the top," Mullen said. "Why were you outside the base today?" "I was waiting for a friend." "Who?" "I can't say." "You can't say?" He sneered. "That's your answer?" Elena tilted her head. "Do you think a real SEAL would hand you names?" The words slipped out sharper than she intended. Silence followed, heavy and sharp. For a brief second, the room stilled. The tall agent's smirk faltered. Mullen's eyes narrowed. He studied her like a specimen under glass. "You talk like someone who's been through it," he admitted slowly. "But the records, there's nothing." "Not a scrap." He tapped the folder again, almost angrily. "So unless you're telling me the government erased your life, which sounds like the plot of a bad movie, you're just another liar wasting my time." Elena's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Maybe the government does. More than you think." The short agent slammed his hand down. "That's it. I've had enough of her act." He turned to Mullen. "Book her. Let a judge deal with it. We're wasting time." But Mullen didn't move. He kept staring at her, conflicted. Something about her presence unsettled him. The discipline, the stillness. Most liars cracked fast. They rambled, contradicted themselves, begged. She didn't. She sat with the kind of calm he had only ever seen in combat veterans, the ones who had stared down death and learned to live with its weight. "Why keep lying?" he asked quietly. "Why not just admit it?" Elena's voice softened, almost a whisper. "Because telling the truth would cost more than prison ever could." For a moment, nobody spoke. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, the recorder's red eye blinking like a heartbeat. Finally, Mullen leaned back, frustration breaking through his professional mask. "Fine, have it your way. You'll rot in holding until you decide you're ready to stop pretending." The tall agent yanked her chair back, preparing to haul her away. But as Elena stood, chained and unbroken, Mullen couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the lie he was chasing wasn't hers, but his own belief that everything fit neatly into files and records. As the door closed behind her, he muttered to himself, "Nobody stays that calm unless they've seen things we can't imagine." And though he wouldn't admit it out loud, the seed of doubt had been planted. The first headline broke before midnight. "Woman arrested for impersonating Navy SEAL." Within hours, it spread like wildfire across news sites, military blogs, and social media feeds. Photographs of Elena in handcuffs, her jaw tight and her eyes unyielding, flashed across television screens. Commentators laughed at the absurdity. Pundits wagged their fingers in outrage, and talking heads repeated the same line with venom. "No woman has ever been a Navy SEAL." End of story. By morning, the nation had already judged her guilty. Inside the holding cell, Elena sat on the cot, staring at the concrete wall as voices of condemnation filtered through the television in the guard's booth. She's pathetic. Stolen valor. Nothing lower than that. They should throw her in prison for good. Every word was a knife. Not because she believed them, but because she had always known this day might come. When you lived in shadows, anonymity was your shield. But if the world ever noticed you, you were defenseless. She had sworn never to seek recognition, never to reveal what had been hidden. And now she was being crucified for crimes she hadn't committed, yet couldn't deny without betraying her oath. The irony was bitter. In Miami, her younger sister Carmen watched the coverage with trembling hands. She stared at the television where Elena's mugshot filled the screen, her big sister, the one she had admired, the one who disappeared for years at a time with no explanation. Carmen called immediately. The line connected after several rings. But when a guard answered, he told her Elena was unavailable for personal calls. So Carmen left a message, her voice breaking. "Lena, please, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't lie to us all these years. I stood up for you. I defended you when people asked where you'd been. Don't make me feel like a fool." Elena never received the message, but even if she had, she wouldn't have known what to say. Back in the interrogation room, the agents weren't finished. They returned with new energy, emboldened by the headlines. "You're famous now," Agent Mullen said with mock cheer. He tossed a newspaper onto the table. Alana's face stared back from the front page under bold black letters. "Fraud in uniform. The world knows what you are. You want to keep playing. Silent hero? Fine, but you'll go down in history as a con artist." Elena glanced at the paper, but said nothing. The short agent leaned forward, sneering. "They hate you, lady. You know that? Vets online are calling for you to be stripped, shamed, and locked up. They'd spit in your face if you walked outside. Right now." She met his eyes, unblinking. "I've been spit on before." That silenced him, just for a second. Something in her tone, a flatness that came from lived experience, cut deeper than bravado. But he quickly recovered, forcing a laugh. "Sure you have. In your imagination." Mullen studied her carefully. The calm hadn't cracked, not once, not even under the weight of nationwide ridicule. He'd interrogated dozens of fakes before, men who claimed Ranger tabs or Green Beret status, who paraded medals they'd bought. On eBay, they all broke when confronted. They stammered, they contradicted themselves, they confessed. But this woman didn't break. She absorbed the hate like stone absorbs rain. Meanwhile, outside those sterile walls, the story had spiraled beyond their control. Veteran forums lit up with fury. Men posted photos of themselves in uniform, swearing oaths of brotherhood and condemning Elena as an insult to every drop of blood spilled in combat. Memes mocked her face, splicing her mugshot with clown makeup. YouTubers and podcast hosts ranted about the wannabe queen of stolen valor, their voices dripping with scorn. For most, it wasn't just about Elena. It was about the idea of someone daring to step into a space sacred to them. "No woman can do what SEALs do," one retired frogman said in an interview. "This chick is delusional." Plain and simple. The world nodded in agreement. Alone in her cell, Elena thought about those words. She had heard them before, during the earliest days of training, whispered by men who didn't believe she would last an hour, let alone years. No woman can do this, yet she had. She had survived the drown-proofing drills that left even strong men gasping. She had carried deer until her spine ached, run through deserts with her lips cracked and bleeding, fought in silence where failure meant death. She had bled beside men who had sworn never to acknowledge her existence. And now the same world that denied she could do it was mocking her for claiming she did. It would have been almost funny if it hadn't cut so deep. In the cafeteria of the federal building, 2 junior agents watched her news coverage on a wall-mounted TV. "She doesn't look like a fake," one muttered. The other shrugged. "They never do at first. But she's too calm. You'd think she'd be crying, begging, if it was all a lie." The second agent sipped his coffee. "Or maybe she's just a better liar than most." Neither noticed Mullen standing nearby, listening. He didn't say a word, but the seed of doubt that had taken root earlier was growing. That night, Elena's name trended nationwide. Hashtags piled up. Hashtag stolen valor queen. Hashtag seal fraud. Hashtag fake hero. Carmen cried quietly at her kitchen table, shutting off her phone after a dozen messages from friends asking if the rumors were true. Strangers sent threats to Elena's dormant social media accounts. Veterans posted videos swearing curses at her name, and through it all, Elena remained silent. She sat on the cot, staring at her hands. They were scarred, calloused proof of a life no one believed. Proof that meant nothing without recognition. Proof she could never display without betraying everything she had promised. The world demanded explanations, apologies, confessions. But Elena Cruz gave them nothing. Because sometimes silence was stronger than words. And sometimes silence was the only thing keeping the truth alive. The booking room smelled of bleach and cold metal, a scent Elena recognized from hospitals and prisons alike. The guards moved briskly, routine dictating every motion stripped the detainee of personal effects. Exchanged civilian clothing for the shapeless gray scrubs issued by the federal holding facility document every mark on the body. Elena stood in silence, her wrists still cuffed, as a female officer stepped forward with gloves snapped tight around her hands. "Arms out," the officer ordered. Elena obeyed. She had endured worse indignities. Medical checkups in dusty tents, inspections before parachute jumps, searches in foreign safe houses where trust was never a guarantee. Compared to those, this was easy. The officer patted her down, catalogued the scars. One on her forearm, the faint white slash of shrapnel. Another across her shoulder, a burn from a flashbang. The officer noted them with professional detachment, chalking them up to accidents or reckless choices. She didn't ask, and Elena didn't explain. When the officer reached Elena's torso, she stopped. Just beneath her ribs, partially hidden by the curve of her shirt, was ink-faded, scarred over, but still unmistakable. The officer frowned. "What's this?" She tugged the shirt up gently. The room stilled. The tattoo wasn't large, no. Bigger than a man's palm, but it carried weight. It wasn't the seal trident everyone knew that symbol. Instead, it was something older, more obscure. A dagger slicing through stylized waves, crowned by a compass rose. The lines were worn, the black ink softened by time, but its design was unmistakable to anyone who had ever brushed against the classified corners of naval special warfare. The officer tilted her head. Some kind of tribal design? Elena said nothing. Her face was impassive, but inside her chest, her heart tightened. That tattoo was not supposed to be seen. It had been burned into her skin at the end of a pipeline most never finished, a mark shared only by those who had survived a program the military never acknowledged. The officer lowered Elena's shirt, her expression puzzled. "I'll make a note of it." She turned to the guards. "Uncuff her. She's changing." The cuffs clicked open, and Elena rubbed her wrists briefly before slipping into the gray scrubs. Her jacket and shirt were folded and bagged, labeled with her case number. The officer left, carrying the note about the tattoo tucked into a file. Down the hall, 2 agents reviewed the report. "She's got some kind of weird tattoo," the officer explained when questioned. "Doesn't match any gang symbols I know. Looks military, though." The short agent waved it off. "So what? Half the fakes ink themselves. I've seen guys with full-blown Ranger tabs tattooed across their backs who never saw basic training." But Mullen didn't dismiss it so easily. He studied the rough sketch the officer had included. Something about it gnawed at him. He had been in this business too long not to recognize the difference between showy, stolen designs and the quiet, cryptic marks that only meant something. To insiders. "This isn't decorative," he muttered. "It's functional. Symbolic." The tall agent scoffed. "She probably Googled it. You can find all kinds of crap online." "Maybe," Mullen said, though doubt colored his tone. "Or maybe not." Back in her cell, Elena sat cross-legged on the cot, her arms folded over her ribs. She thought of the night she earned that tattoo. The final exercise had nearly killed her 24 hours without sleep. Weighted swims across black water that seemed endless, navigation drills through coastal marshland with nothing but a compass and the stars. By the time she staggered back to camp, her body was broken, her mind barely functioning. But she had made it. Out of 30 who started, only 5 remained. The mark had been etched into her skin by an instructor who said nothing, his needle buzzing in the darkness of a makeshift tent. No ceremony, no celebration. Just a scar of ink that bound them all in silence. She had never regretted it. Until now. Now that mark might be the one thing that pulled her further into the light she had sworn to avoid. The next day, Mullen returned with a photograph. He dropped it onto the table in front of her. It was a zoomed-in image of her ribcage, the tattoo. Grainy but visible. "Explain this," he demanded. Elena glanced at it, but didn't touch. "You already know I can't." "You expect me to believe this is some secret symbol?" Mullen asked. "No," Elena said simply. "I don't expect you to believe anything." The tall agent snorted. "There it is again. The classified excuse. She probably got that ink at some biker shop in Pensacola." Mullen didn't laugh. He kept staring at Elena, his jaw tightening. "Who else has this tattoo?" Elena leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. Her silence was louder than words. The tall agent slammed his fist against the table. "Answer the damn question." She met his fury with a calm that chilled the room. "If you know, then you already know I can't." That night, Mullen couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk, the image of the tattoo spread before him. He pulled out old contacts, made discreet calls, asked quiet questions he wasn't supposed to ask. Most gave him nothing but silence. A few hung up without a word. But one, an old acquaintance in naval intelligence, whispered 2 sentences before cutting the line. "You shouldn't be asking about that. And if she has it, she's not who you think she is." Mullen stared at the phone long after the call ended, unease curling in his stomach. Meanwhile, rumors spread inside the facility itself. Guards whispered about the tattoo, speculating if Elena had ties to secret units. Some dismissed it as fantasy, but others couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She didn't act like a fraud. She acted like someone who had been trained to endure, to wait, to survive. And when word reached the retired Admiral, who had once commanded naval special warfare, he requested to see the detainee personally. Elena sat on her cot, her hands folded calmly, when the door opened and a figure stepped inside. For the first time since her arrest, her eyes flickered with recognition. The door to the holding wing opened with unusual ceremony. 2 guards first, and a figure who carried the weight of authority without saying a word. His uniform was gone. He wore a civilian suit, dark and pressed, but his bearing was unmistakable. His back was ramrod straight, his steps measured and deliberate. His hair was silver, cropped short in a style that no civilian barber would ever replicate. Admiral James Holloway had commanded naval special warfare for nearly a decade before. His retirement. To those in the community, his name was legend. To the agents in the room, it was an unwelcome complication. "Admiral," Mullen greeted stiffly, rising to his feet. "I wasn't expecting." "You weren't supposed to expect anything," Holloway interrupted. His voice was low, gravel-edged, carrying more authority in 4 words than Mullen's. "Entire presence. Where is she?" Mullen hesitated and gestured toward the interrogation room. Holloway walked past without another word, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tile. Inside, Elena sat at the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't look up when the door opened. She had already felt the shift. In the air calm, but heavy. This wasn't another agent. This was someone who belonged to the world she came from. The Admiral stopped a few feet from her. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply studied her posture, her scars, the faint but telling details that no impostor could mimic. "Elena Cruz," he said finally. It wasn't a question. Her head lifted, her dark eyes meeting his. For the first time since her arrest, her composure wavered. Not fear, not surprise, but recognition. "Admiral," she said quietly. The word carried weight. The agents watching through the one-way glass shifted uncomfortably. It was one thing for her to call herself a SEAL in the abstract. It was another to greet one of the most respected leaders in naval special warfare, as if she had once stood under his command. Holloway circled the table slowly. "I hear you've caused quite a stir." His tone was even, but his eyes flicked to the manila folder lying open on the desk, her empty record, her so-called life of lies. "They think I'm pretending," Elena said. "Are you?" She didn't answer. Not because she couldn't, but because the oath she carried bound her tighter than any set of cuffs. Holloway stopped behind her chair. His gaze lingered on the edge of her gray scrubs, with a faint outline of ink pressed against fabric. "Lift your shirt," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Elena hesitated, then tugged the fabric upward, baring her ribs. The Admiral leaned in, close enough that only he could see clearly. His eyes narrowed, tracing the faded lines, the scar tissue around the ink. It wasn't the crisp, decorative tattoo of a fraud. It was worn, aged, earned through sweat and silence. He stood there for a long time. Then he leaned toward Mullen, who stood just inside the doorway, trying not to show his discomfort. "That tattoo's real," Holloway whispered, his voice sharp as a blade. "She's one of ours." The words detonated in the room. Mullen blinked, stunned. "That's impossible." "Sir, with respect, there's no record." "Of course there isn't," Holloway cut in. His eyes snapped toward the agent, icy and uncompromising. "Some warriors are written in ink, others in shadows. If you had the clearance to see what I've seen, you wouldn't be standing here arguing with me." Elena lowered her shirt, her face expressionless once more. But inside, something uncoiled. For years, she had lived invisible. For days, she had been treated like a liar. Now, finally, someone who mattered had acknowledged her truth. Mullen swallowed hard. "Sir, are you telling me she—" "I'm telling you nothing," Holloway said sharply. "Because this conversation doesn't exist. You never heard my words, and you'll never repeat them. Do you understand?" The tall agent shifted uncomfortably. "But Admiral, if she really, Holloway snapped, then you're meddling in something far above your pay grade. And if she isn't, then you've wasted my time. Either way, you'll drop the sneers and start showing respect." The agents exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't used to being dressed down, especially not by someone with Holloway's authority. But his presence filled the room like a storm, impossible to resist. When the Admiral turned back to Elena, his eyes softened slightly. "You've kept your silence well," he said. Elena allowed herself the smallest nod. "As promised." "Good. Keep it that way." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "There are people who'd bury you deeper than this cell if you said too much. You know that." "I know," she whispered. For a moment, the weight of years hung between them, missions unacknowledged, sacrifices erased, bonds formed in the crucible of war, only to be dissolved by secrecy. Holloway understood. She understood. The men in suits never would. Outside the glass, the agents whispered furiously. "What the hell is going on?" the tall one muttered. "Are we really supposed to believe this?" Mullen rubbed his forehead, the photograph of the tattoo still fresh in his mind. He didn't want to believe it, but disbelief had become impossible. Holloway straightened, smoothing the front of his suit. She stays under my authority until I say otherwise, he declared. You'll remove her from the system immediately. Mullen stammered. But sir, the charges... Drop them, Holloway ordered. Seal the files. This arrest never happened. The tall agent bristled. With respect, Admiral, we can't just erase a federal arrest. There's already media coverage. Then manage it, Holloway snapped. Spin it. Delay it. Vary it. That's your problem. What's mine is making sure this woman never sees a courtroom. The room fell silent. Elena watched the exchange. With quiet detachment, though her chest tightened. She hated that she needed saving, hated even more that her existence depended on men like Holloway pulling invisible strings. But that was the bargain she had made long ago, her life traded for silence. Her service erased for the sake of programs the public wasn't ready to know. When Holloway met her eyes again, he spoke softly enough that only she could hear. You're not out of the woods yet. Keep your head down. Let me handle this. Elena gave him the same answer she had given years ago, in a tent at the edge of the desert, when asked if she understood the terms of her service. Yes, sir, as the Admiral. Left, the weight of his words lingered. The agents were left in uneasy silence, their certainty shattered. Elena sat alone at the table, her cuffs still locked, her face still composed. But inside, she felt something new. Not relief, not yet, but validation. For the first time since her arrest, she knew the truth wasn't buried entirely. Someone still remembered. And that meant she wasn't entirely a ghost. The day after Admiral Holloway's visit, the detention facility buzzed with an energy that no one dared name aloud. Guards avoided eye contact. Agents whispered in corners, their words clipped and nervous. Everyone had heard some version of the Admiral's verdict, though the exact phrasing, "She's one of ours," was already mutating into rumor. Agent Mullen sat at his desk, staring at the manila folder that was supposed to contain Elena Cruz's life story. It was still empty. No military service record, no enlistment papers, no discharge. Just a driver's license, a passport, and a handful of unremarkable documents that painted her as nobody special. But his instincts gnawed at him. Holloway's whisper wasn't something he could shrug off. If the Admiral was right, then this woman wasn't just another stolen valor case. She was something else entirely. Mullen opened a restricted database and began another search, widening parameters, using clearance levels he wasn't technically authorized to touch. Dead ends piled up. Access denied. Record sealed. And then he hit something strange. It wasn't a file, it was the absence of one. A gap in the archives where personnel numbers should have flowed in neat sequence. It was like a page torn from a book, leaving nothing but ragged edges. He leaned back in his chair, uneasy. In his years working counterintelligence, he'd seen redacted files. He'd seen top-secret classifications. But this was different. This was deliberate erasure. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure nothing remained. That evening, Mullen made a call. The line buzzed before a cautious voice answered. "You didn't get this number from me," the man said. "I'm looking for records," Mullen replied. A woman named Elena Cruz, supposedly Navy, possibly Special Operations. The line was silent for several seconds. Then, "Stop." "Excuse me?" "Stop digging," the voice snapped. "You don't know what you're playing with." Mullen's grip on the receiver tightened. "Just tell me if she's legit." "You're asking the wrong question," a voice said. "If she exists in the way you think, then she doesn't exist at all. Not in the system. Not on paper. If you're smart, you'll let this go before someone makes sure you don't exist either." The line went dead. Mullen sat there, the silence heavy. He'd heard warnings before, but this one carried a chill that sank into his bones. Meanwhile, Elena lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling. The Admiral's words still echoed in her head. "You're not out of the woods yet." She knew what was happening outside her cell. Agents digging, files locked, whispers in corridors. It always played out the same way: curiosity, colliding with walls higher than anyone could climb. She almost pitied them. Almost. Her thoughts drifted back years, to the first time she had realized what her service would cost. It was during the intake briefing of the pilot program. A colonel had stood at the front of a room filled with exhausted candidates, men and women who had clawed their way through the crucible of selection. "If you succeed," the colonel said, "you will never wear a uniform in public again. You will never receive medals, never see your name etched in stone, never be recognized for what you've done. Your existence will be deniable. Your failures will not be tolerated. And your victories will never belong to you." Most of the room had shifted uncomfortably. A few had dropped out within hours. But Elena had stayed. She'd known then that silence was the price of making history. Now, years later, that silence was suffocating her. In Washington, Admiral Holloway sat in a secure office far from the public eye. A younger officer handed him a file stamped "Eyes" only across the top. Holloway flipped it open. Inside were thin pages documenting the program he had once overseen, a program designed to test the limits of integration long before politicians were willing to admit it existed. Women had always fought, always bled, but never in this way, never in the Tier 1 shadows reserved for ghosts. Elena had been one of the few to survive it. He closed the file and locked it away again. Even in retirement, his clearance didn't permit him to keep it on his desk for long. Holloway exhaled slowly. He had vouched for her in that interrogation room, but he knew the truth. His word alone might not be enough. Too many people would prefer she vanish. Too many secrets tied to her name. Still, he couldn't let her burn for the crime of surviving. Back at the facility, Mullen finally snapped. He stormed into the observation room where Elena was seated, his tie loosened, his patience gone. "Who are you?" he demanded, slamming a folder on the table. "I've run every database. You don't exist. Not as a sailor, not as a soldier. Nothing. So tell me the truth. What are you?" Elena looked up slowly, her gaze calm, steady. "Exactly what you see? You're a ghost," Mullen growled. "Not by choice," she said softly. The tall agent, standing in the corner, scoffed. "She's playing you. Don't you see it? She's using the mystery to sell the lie." Mullen ignored him. His eyes locked with Elena's. "What did you do to make them erase you?" For the first time, her composure cracked. Her lips parted, as if words hovered just behind them. But then she closed her mouth, swallowed, and looked away. "I can't tell you," she whispered. Mullen slammed his fist on the table. "Why not?" "Because you wouldn't survive knowing," she said. The words weren't arrogance. They were fact, cold and heavy. Later that night, as the agents filed their reports, an encrypted message arrived on Mullen's screen. "Cease inquiry. Reassign. Case. All materials sealed." It was signed with an authorization code so high Mullen didn't even recognize it. His jaw tightened. He had seen investigations buried before, but never this fast, never this absolutely. It was as though Elena Cruz was being swallowed whole by the very system he served. He sat back in his chair, staring at the order. For the first time in years, he felt like the ground beneath him wasn't stable. Somewhere in the shadows, Elena's real life was written in ink he would never see. And for reasons he couldn't name, that terrified him more than any fraud ever could. The next morning, the fluorescent lights in the interrogation room hummed louder than usual. Elena sat in the same chair she had occupied for days, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her restraint wasn't an act. It was training, honed through years of being pushed beyond exhaustion, and taught never to give anything away. Across from her, Agent Mullen entered carrying a thin stack of papers. His tie was loose, his eyes rimmed with fatigue. He had spent another sleepless night wrestling with orders that made no sense, warnings he couldn't ignore, and the knowing certainty that the woman before him was something more than the fraud she was accused of being. He dropped the papers on the table. "Do you know what this is?" Elena didn't even glance down. "Another file that says I don't exist?" His jaw tightened. "Exactly. Nothing. No record of training. No deployment logs. No commendations. If I didn't know better, I'd say you'd never stepped foot on a base in your life." Her eyes flickered just for a moment, then stilled. "And yet, here I am." The tall agent leaned against the wall, arms folded, his disdain sharp as ever. "She's playing us." Every word, every pause calculated. "This is what con artists do." Mullen turned, snapping. "Then explain Holloway. Explain why he'd walk in here, see her tattoo, and say what he said." The tall agent faltered, but covered it with a sneer. "Old man probably got sentimental. He's not in command anymore. Doesn't mean she's telling the truth." Elena watched the argument unfold, as though she were a ghost in her own trial. At last, she spoke. "You want the truth?" Both men froze. Elena's voice was calm, even, but edged with something raw. "I didn't come here to deceive anyone. I came here because someone inside your system flagged me as a threat. They saw me near a base, assumed stolen valor, and dragged me in. Fine, that's the game. But don't mistake my silence for guilt. I stay quiet because the moment I speak too much, I put people in danger, including you." Mullen frowned. "Danger from what?" "From the truth," she said simply. The tall agent snorted. "That's cute. Real spooky. What truth, Cruz? That you're some kind of super soldier the government erased? You expect us to swallow that?" Elena leaned forward, her gaze sharp as a blade. "I expect nothing. I've been trained not to expect anything. Not recognition, not trust, not safety. But I'll give you something, since you've both worked so hard to break me." The room went still. "You want to know where I was in 2011? She asked softly. "When every database says I was a waitress in Jacksonville. I was in the Horn of Africa, inside a village that never made the news. I was there when an asset went dark, when a local warlord started carving people apart for information he thought we carried. I got 3 children out alive. The rest," she broke off, her jaw tight. "The rest didn't make it." Mullen swallowed, hard. The tall agent shifted uneasily, suddenly unsure. "You think I inked this tattoo in a biker bar?" Elena tugged her shirt just enough to reveal the faded Dagger and Waves emblem. "This was given to me after I carried one of those kids 4 miles through swamp and gunfire. After I dragged a teammate's body across a border we weren't supposed to cross. They burned this into my skin because no metal could ever exist for what we did." For a long moment, silence crushed the room. Mullen's voice was hoarse when he spoke. "Why hide it? Why erase you?" Elena's eyes softened, not with pity, but with the weight of someone who knew more than she could say. "Because the country wasn't ready. Because women in my position weren't supposed to exist. Because admitting what we did would unravel threads that can't be pulled. Easier to pretend we were never there." The tall agent finally muttered, "You expect us to believe all this? With no proof?" The door opened before Elena could answer. Admiral Holloway stepped inside, his presence filling the room. He looked at Elena first, then the agents. "Proof is irrelevant. She's telling the truth." Mullen straightened. "Sir, with respect." "With respect," Holloway interrupted sharply. "You're out of your depth. You're chasing phantoms." Because your system doesn't account for what lives in the dark. Cruz is one of those phantoms. She served where no one else could, and she paid for it by being erased. Elena looked down at the table, her throat tight. Holloway's defense was unexpected, but not unwelcome. For years, she had borne the silence alone. Hearing someone else speak it aloud, even vaguely, was like air after drowning. The tall agent still looked unconvinced. If she's who you say, why not clear her? Why let her rot in here? Because clearing her means exposing programs that don't exist on paper, Holloway said coldly. Because men more powerful than you will burn entire archives before they admit she's real. And because some warriors are never meant to be celebrated. They're meant to be forgotten. Elena's voice was quiet, but firm. I didn't ask for celebration. I asked to be left alone. Mullen sat heavily in his chair, his mind racing. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that the justice system wasn't supposed to work this way. And yet, staring at Elena, listening to Holloway, he felt the ground shifting beneath his beliefs. Holloway turned to the agents. You'll drop this investigation. You'll seal the files. And you'll forget her name. The tall agent opened his mouth, but Holloway's eyes silenced him instantly. Then the Admiral faced Elena one last time. His voice softened. You've carried this burden longer than most could endure. Hold it a little longer. The world may never know, but those who matter, those who served with you, remember. For the first time since her arrest, Elena allowed a flicker of emotion to show. Her eyes glistened, not with weakness, but with the release of a truth finally spoken, if only in fragments. When the Admiral left, silence filled the room again. But it was different now, thicker, heavier. The truth had been revealed. Not enough to change her fate, but enough to prove she wasn't a fraud. Enough to remind her she wasn't alone. The decision came down faster than anyone expected. One morning, the facility buzzed with tension. The next, it was eerily calm. A memo circulated through the agents' ranks, stamped with layers of clearance codes most of them had never seen. The message was blunt. Case dismissed. All files sealed. No further inquiry authorized. By afternoon, Elena Cruz's arrest no longer existed. Her booking photo, fingerprints, and paperwork were purged from the system, as though she had never been inside those walls. Even the guards who had walked her down corridors were told to forget her, but the public wasn't so easily erased. Headlines still lingered online. Woman arrested for faking Navy SEAL status. Comment sections bristled with outrage, with mocking laughter, with scornful veterans denouncing her as a parasite. No one issued a correction. No press release exonerated her. The silence surrounding her release was louder than any defense. When Elena stepped back into daylight, the world saw only a woman in borrowed clothes, walking free without explanation. The public assumed leniency. The truth was far stranger. She left the facility with nothing but a duffel bag of her belongings, and the faint smell of bleach clinging to her skin. The air outside was sharp with autumn, and for the first time in weeks, she tilted her face toward the sun. It warmed her cheekbones, but it didn't ease the cold inside her chest. A car waited. At the curb, Admiral Holloway stood beside it, one hand resting on the roof. He wasn't in uniform. He hadn't been for years, but he carried himself like a man still wearing stars on his shoulder. You're free, he said simply as she approached. Elena gave a humorless smile. Am I? He didn't answer immediately. He just opened the door, and she slid inside. The ride was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the silence between them. At last, Elena spoke. They'll still think I'm a fraud. Yes, Holloway admitted. They'll think that because it's easier. Easier for them to hate what they don't understand than to face truths they're not ready for. Elena's fingers traced the faint scar tissue around her tattoo through the fabric of her shirt. Then what was it all for? Holloway glanced at her, his expression grave. It was for the ones who couldn't, for the children you carried out of the fire, for the teammates who never came home, for the missions that stopped wars before they started. You may not have a name on a wall, Cruz, but you have something heavier. You have ghosts who lived because you fought. His words were meant as comfort, but they landed like stones in her stomach. Ghosts were not medals. Ghosts didn't hold parades. Ghosts haunted. When the car dropped her off at a modest apartment complex in Hurlington, Holloway placed a hand on her shoulder before she stepped out. "Stay low," he said. "Keep quiet. You've been forgotten officially. That's protection in its way. Don't tempt the people who want it to stay that way." Elena nodded, though her throat tightened. She had lived under orders for so long that obeying them had become second nature. Yet this order felt crueler than any before. Exist, but only in silence. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, the key heavy in her palm. Inside, the place was exactly as she'd left it. Sparse furniture, a single framed photograph of her parents, a kettle still sitting on the stove. It felt both safe and suffocating. She dropped the duffel bag by the door and sat on the edge of her bed. For the first time since the arrest, the tears came not loud or messy, but silent, steady streaks down her cheeks. Not because she feared prison or death, but because she had been reminded once again that her life was not her own. Days passed. The world moved on. News cycles shifted to scandals and elections, leaving her story to rot in dusty corners of the internet. Friends stopped calling, unsure what to believe. Family members kept their distance, embarrassed by the headlines. At the grocery store, Elena caught whispers. Someone recognized her face from an article. She walked away before the whispers became stares. She avoided veterans' bars, avoided reunions, avoided anywhere the word SEAL might be spoken aloud. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had bled alongside them, trained harder than most, survived missions that destroyed men twice her size, and yet, to the world, she was nothing but a thief of valor. She swallowed the bitterness like medicine. It was what she had signed up for, after all. One evening, as rain tapped against her window, a letter arrived in an unmarked envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in firm, steady strokes. "You're not forgotten. Not by all of us." J. H. Elena stared at the signature for a long time. Holloway's initials. She folded the letter carefully and slid it into her journal, where she kept scraps of memory, a pressed flower from a village in Afghanistan, a photo torn from a training manual, the names of 3 teammates who would never age another day. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a fragile smile. Life didn't return to normal. It couldn't. Normal was for people who had never been erased. Instead, Elena built a quieter life, teaching self-defense at a community center under a false resume, volunteering at shelters, walking the Potomac trails at dawn when few people were awake. She blended in. She became invisible again. But sometimes, when she passed a stranger with a certain bearing, when she glimpsed a scar that told a story she couldn't speak aloud, their eyes met, and in that moment, she knew she wasn't the only ghost. Years from now, the story of the woman who faked being a SEAL would linger online, half forgotten but never corrected. People would still scoff at her name. Veterans would still denounce her in bars. Young men would still laugh, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it. But in the shadows, in quiet circles of those who had once walked the same secret paths, Elena Cruz's name was spoken differently. Not with scorn, with respect, with recognition. They knew the truth. And though she could never say it aloud, though her battles would never fill textbooks or inspire parades, Elena carried that truth like a hidden metal pressed against her skin. She was a warrior. She was a ghost. And she had been one of theirs all along.